Welcome once again to another edition of Shelf Life Book Reviews Online. If you're watching this on YouTube, hopefully you will subscribe to my YouTube channel. Or if you're watching this on Facebook, hopefully you will add me to your favorites list and you will forward this to your friends. This time out, I'm bringing to your attention two great fiction books. Actually, they are reprints of classic comic books, and these two are classics. No question about it. The very first one is SHOCK Suspenstories, the EC Archives. This is published by Dark Horse, and it retails for $25.99. This book reprints issues 1 through 6 of SHOCK Suspenstories that EC Comics put out. EC Comics was a very popular comic company in the 1940s and the 1950s. EC stood for Educational Comics. And they were very controversial because so many of their titles were very graphic, horror-wise. The artwork was really over the top in many ways, and there was a backlash that suddenly came. A psychologist, I think his name was Frederick Wortham, he said that they were horrible, that they corrupted youth, and they led to juvenile delinquency. And because of this, there was a hearing. The U.S. Senate subcommittee looked into these, and they decreed as well, too, that these were not good for youth, and that eventually the public pressure forced this company, EC Comics, to abandon or, discontinue most of their horror titles, and then they went for tamer publications. But in the interim, it is great to see these classics because SHOCK Suspenstories not only had some horror, it was not as graphic, it was toned down, but what we find in these stories were actually stories with morals. There was one particular one called The Patriot, about this parade where people were watching, veterans and things like that, and this one man in the crowd, he just stood there and he didn't take off his hat. He had no emotion. And the people around him said, "You commie, get out of here." And they yelled at him. They screamed at him. And eventually they started to beat him up. And they beat him so badly that they killed him. And the man's wife came along. And she was in shock. And the people in the crowd said, "Well, he didn't take his hat off. He didn't smile. He didn't do anything when the veterans walked by." And the wife said, "He was a veteran. He was a victim of a bomb blast, and it stopped him from smiling. And he was also blind." And so it's like it really was a powerful thing. There was another story where new people came to the block, and the family was Jewish, and the people screamed at them, "No, the Jews." And so really this book was an early look at racial inequality. The blacks, there's stories about black people, that they're inferior, but these comics showed that everyone was equal, and that it really was a moral of the story that outshone any part of horror. So, but there were some horror stories here, including some standout titles like Neat Job, The Guilty, Just Desserts, Halloween, and one called The Rug, where this man had bearskin rugs, and at the end we find it wasn't a bearskin rug, but it was a human rug. So let's just say, if you're looking for a great blast from the past, EC Comics, you can't go wrong. So this is a highly recommended book to see what comics of the past were all about. Now the second book of note, and I should point out as well too, with the first book that I mentioned, the foreword to the book was written by none other than Steven Spielberg. And he said that he used these comics for inspiration, for life, and for the B movies that he watched as well too. So the second book is The Haunt of Fear, the EC Archives, published by Dark Horse again, and this retails for $25.99. This book features reprints of classic issues of The Haunt of Fear, issues 4 through 6 and 15 through 17. And The Haunt of Fear was another popular EC title, and these stories were narrated by none other than the Old Witch, the Vault Keeper, and the Crypt Keeper. So these stories were also tinged with a real wild touch of horror, but it's not graphic. It will insinuate that someone was killed, but it's not graphic. It doesn't show the knife going into anybody. It just sort of shows part of a body lying there on the floor. So it's sort of horror light, if you want to make a definition of it. Now, The Haunt of Fear was also one of those books that got a lot of controversy, just like the reproductions of the ones from the first one that I mentioned. EC Comics was really ahead of its time because they didn't rely like DC Comics and Timely Comics, which later became Marvel. They were all superheroes. Well, the EC line did not have superheroes. They relied basically on horror, war, crime, and many other areas where, there were no heroes here. There was no Superman, there was no Batman, there was no Wonder Woman. And but the people in here were human beings who got a touch of the supernatural and a touch of the occult. And there's witches, ghosts, ghouls, and everything else. So this book has a lot of standout stories too. Now the reproductions here are really nice of the classic, covers of the classic stories, and such stories here as The Tunnel of Terror, Monster Maker, Nightmare, and The Killer in the Coffin. There usually was some twist by the end of the book, or the end of the story. And so if you want two great classic books, you cannot go wrong with the two that I've mentioned. So when you're out planning your purchases, if you want a blast from the past in the world of EC Comics, you can't go wrong with these two. So hopefully when you make your purchases, add these to your list and look for other Dark Horse titles, because they have reproduced most of the line of the EC Comics from the 50s or the 40s and the 50s. So those are the two titles this time out. So hopefully you'll send me your comments, positive and negative, and I'll see you again real soon. As always, stay safe and stay sane, and we'll talk again. Bye for now.